The morning of November 24, 1944, broke grey and cold over Isley Field on Saipan. At precisely 9:45, Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell pushed the throttles forward on his Boeing B-29 Superfortress, call-sign Dauntless Dotty, and felt the massive aircraft strain against a bomb load heavier than anything Japanese defenders had ever faced. Beneath the fuselage, distributed across the cavernous bomb bays, hung 12,000 pounds of high-explosive ordnance. The target lay 1,500 miles to the north across the frigid Pacific waters. Tokyo, the beating heart of the Japanese Empire, a city that had not felt American bombs since Jimmy Doolittle's daring raid 2.5 years earlier. O'Donnell's formation that morning represented the culmination of 3 years of the most expensive weapons development program in American history. 111 B-29 Superfortresses, each costing $600,000, would climb to altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, heights where Japanese interceptors gasped for air and anti-aircraft shells fell short of their targets. At that altitude, the American crews were told they would be untouchable. The mathematics of high-altitude precision bombing suggested they could devastate Japanese industry with impunity, raining destruction from elevations the enemy simply could not reach. The jet-powered future of strategic warfare had arrived, wrapped in aluminum and powered by 4 massive Wright Cyclone engines. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What happened in the months following that first Tokyo raid would reveal a story not of technological inevitability, but of American assumptions colliding with atmospheric reality. The question that hung in the freezing air above Japan was not whether the B-29 could fly higher than Japanese defenses, could reach the engineering specifications proved it could. The question was whether accurate bombing from 30,000 feet was physically possible when faced with wind speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, temperatures that froze equipment and crew alike, and atmospheric phenomena that meteorologists had barely begun to understand. O'Donnell believed high-altitude precision bombing would work. His bombardiers, peering through their Norden bomb sights at targets 5 miles below, were less certain. The Japanese defenders, watching through binoculars as American formations left vapor trails across the sky, were simply calculating how long this apparent American advantage would persist. To understand why hundreds of B-29 bombers carrying the most sophisticated avionics ever designed were converging on Japanese cities from altitudes no bomber had ever sustained operationally, one must first grasp the peculiar mathematics of strategic bombing doctrine in the Second World War. The B-29 Superfortress, completed in its production form in 1943, represented Boeing's answer to a requirement the Army Air Corps had issued before Pearl Harbor was even conceivable as a target. The specification called for a bomber capable of crossing an ocean, striking an enemy homeland, and returning safely a weapon that could project American air power across distances that made European strategic bombing look like tactical sorties. The aircraft that emerged from Boeing's Seattle plant embodied engineering ambitions that bordered on reckless. The B-29 measured 99 feet from nose to tail, with a wingspan of 141 feet. It weighed 74,000 pounds empty and could carry bomb loads exceeding 20,000 pounds when stripped of unnecessary equipment. 4 Wright R-3350 Cyclone 18-cylinder radial engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, drove the Superfortress through air so thin that conventional bombers could not operate. These specifications alone made the B-29 extraordinary, but its true revolutionary features lay in systems designed specifically for high-altitude combat. The aircraft featured a pressurized cabin, the first heavy bomber to incorporate this technology, allowing crews to operate at altitudes exceeding 35,000 feet without oxygen masks or cumbersome heated flight suits. Remote-controlled gun turrets, directed by a central fire control computer, replaced the multiple gunners required on B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds. The APQ-13 radar bombing system theoretically enabled precision strikes through cloud cover that would ground conventional bombers. Most critically, for the doctrine that would emerge, the B-29 possessed a service ceiling of 36,000 feet when carrying moderate bomb loads. This altitude capability formed the foundation of American strategic thinking about the bomber's employment. At 30,000 feet, American planners calculated the B-29 would operate beyond the effective ceiling of Japanese interceptor aircraft. Intelligence assessments in mid-1944 placed the best Japanese fighters, the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, at operational ceilings around 32,000 feet, but noted that combat effectiveness declined precipitously above 28,000 feet as engines starved for oxygen and pilots struggled with control response times measured in long, dangerous seconds. Japanese anti-aircraft artillery posed even less theoretical threat. The Type 88 75mm anti-aircraft gun, introduced in 1928 and still the most numerous heavy flak weapon defending Japanese cities, fired a 14.5-pound shell to a maximum altitude of 23,550 feet. The weapon was demonstrably inaccurate above 16,000 feet, where thin air caused shells to tumble unpredictably. The Japanese had introduced the Type 3 120mm gun in 1943, specifically to counter the B-29 threat. Intelligence reports noted this weapon could reach altitudes B-29 seconds operated at, but only 120 units had been produced by mid-1944, and most defended only Tokyo, Osaka, and other critical industrial centers. The mathematical conclusion appeared inescapable. B-29 seconds, bombing from 30,000 feet, would suffer minimal losses while delivering unprecedented destructive power. The doctrine built on this technological advantage became known as high-altitude daylight precision bombing, the same strategy that had guided American operations over Germany, now adapted to Pacific distances and Japanese targets. The theory held that formations of B-29 seconds, flying in mutually supporting combat boxes at 30,000 feet, would approach targets in daylight when northern bomb sites functioned optimally. Bombardiers would acquire specific aim points, aircraft factories, steel mills, oil, refineries, and release weapons with the precision American bombing surveys in Europe suggested was achievable. The bombs would fall for approximately 45 seconds, covering nearly 5 vertical miles before impact. During this fall, careful calculations of wind speed, air density, and ballistic characteristics would guide each weapon to its intended target, with what pre-war tests suggested was remarkable accuracy. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, had staked his professional reputation and his vision for an independent air force on this strategy. The B-29 program had cost $3.7 billion more than the Manhattan Project would ultimately require. Arnold had fought bitter bureaucratic battles to secure resources for the Superfortress, while the European theatre demanded ever more B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds. He had promised the Joint Chiefs of Staff that B-29 seconds would devastate Japanese industrial capacity, forcing surrender, without the need for a bloody invasion of the home islands that casualty projections suggested could cost 500,000 American lives. By November 1944, Arnold's gamble was ready for its defining test. The capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in June and July of that year had provided exactly what planners needed. Island bases within B-29 range of Tokyo, connected to American supply lines by naval vessels that could deliver fuel, ordnance, and replacement aircraft without the impossible logistics that had plagued earlier operations from China. Construction battalions had carved massive runways from coral and volcanic rock. Isley Field on Saipan boasted an 8,500-foot runway capable of handling fully loaded superfortresses. North Field on Guam would eventually support 4 entire bomb groups, becoming the largest bomber base in the Pacific Theater. The 21st Bomber Command, established under Brigadier General Haywood Hansell in August 1944, represented the organizational structure through which Arnold's strategic vision would be executed. Hansell was a true believer in daylight precision bombing. He had helped write the Air Corps Tactical School's bombing doctrine and had commanded bomber forces over Europe before transferring to the Pacific. He understood the theory perfectly. High altitude removed the bombers from most defenses. Daylight enabled visual bombing with northern sights, and precision targeting would systematically dismantle Japanese war-making capacity. The first combat test of this theory came not over Tokyo, but during shakedown missions against bypassed Japanese bases at Truk in late October. These missions revealed problems that should have generated immediate doctrinal reconsideration, but instead were dismissed as teething troubles with new equipment operating in unfamiliar conditions. 4 B-29 seconds, aborted with engine problems, a failure rate of 22% that would have grounded any other aircraft pending investigation. The remaining bombers scattered their ordnance across Truk's installations with what generous after-action reports described as moderate effectiveness. Crews reported engine overheating at cruise power settings, turret malfunctions in the thin, cold air, and bombardier complaints that high-altitude winds made target acquisition difficult. Hansel attributed these problems to crew inexperience and ordered intensified training. The mission to Tokyo on November 24th was planned with meticulous attention to the doctrine Hansel had spent his career perfecting. The target was the Musashino aircraft plant, located in Tokyo's western suburbs, a sprawling complex where Nakajima manufactured engines for the Ki-84 fighters that represented Japan's best hope of countering B-29 raids. Destroying this single facility would, intelligence analysts calculated, reduce Japanese fighter production by nearly 30%. The mission profile specified bombing from altitudes between 27,000 and 32,000 feet in daylight, using northern bomb sites calibrated for the precise conditions meteorologists predicted would exist over Tokyo at mission time. 111 B-29 seconds lifted off from Saipan beginning at 0945. 17 aborted before reaching Japan. Engine problems, pressurization failures, and mechanical malfunctions that continued to plague the aircraft, despite months of testing and modification. The remaining 94 bombers proceeded toward Tokyo in formation, climbing steadily as they crossed the Pacific. Crews noted the climb took longer than training exercises over Kansas had suggested. The heavily loaded aircraft, carrying maximum fuel for the 3,000-mile round trip plus full bomb loads, struggled to reach assigned altitudes. Several bombers topped out at 26,000 feet, unable to climb higher without jettisoning bombs or fuel. But it was what the crews encountered at bombing altitude that shattered every assumption American planners had made about high-altitude operations over Japan. As the B-29 seconds approached 30,000 feet, navigators reported ground speed measurements that made no mathematical sense. Aircraft showing indicated airspeeds of 230 miles per hour, speeds that should have produced ground speeds around 200 miles per hour, accounting for normal upper-level winds, were instead recording ground speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour when flying with the wind, or dropping below 50 miles per hour when attempting to fly against it. Several bombardiers, attempting to establish proper sight settings as their aircraft approached Tokyo, watched in disbelief as landmarks on their radar scopes appeared to move backward. The aircraft was flying into a headwind, strong enough to produce negative ground speed, despite engines straining at full cruise power. The phenomenon the B-29 crews had encountered was what Japanese meteorologist Wasaburo Oishi had documented in the 1920s while tracking high-altitude winds using weather balloons, powerful atmospheric rivers flowing west to east at altitudes between 20%, 1,000 and 40,000 feet, with core velocities sometimes exceeding 300 miles per hour. Oishi had published his findings in Esperanto, attempting to reach international audiences, but his work went largely unnoticed outside Japan. Western meteorologists in 1944 understood that upper-level winds existed and could be strong, but they had no framework for comprehending sustained wind speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour, concentrated in relatively narrow bands. The jet stream, as it would be named in 1947, remained unknown to the Americans planning high-altitude bombing campaigns. The consequences for bombing accuracy were catastrophic. The Norden bomb sight, that marvel of analog computing that had cost $1,657 per unit to manufacture, functioned by calculating a ballistic trajectory from the aircraft to the target. The bombardier would input altitude, indicated airspeed, and observed drift the angle between the aircraft's heading and its actual track over the ground caused by crosswinds. The sight then solved the complex differential equations governing a bomb's fall, determining the precise moment when release would result in impact at the desired aim point. The system worked beautifully when the atmosphere between bomber and target contained winds that varied gradually and predictably with altitude. Over Tokyo on November 24, 1944, the atmosphere contained nothing predictable. Wind speeds at 30,000 feet exceeded 200 miles per hour. At 20,000 feet, winds might be 60 miles per hour from a completely different direction. At 10,000 feet, yet another wind regime prevailed. A bomb, released over the Musashino plant from 30,000 feet, would fall for 43 seconds through these violently shifting wind layers. During its descent, the bomb would be pushed miles off course by forces. The Norden site, which calculated drift based only on winds at bombing altitude, could not possibly account for. The bombardiers over Tokyo that morning did their best. They acquired the Musashino plant in their sights, made corrections for observed drift, and released when the mechanical computer indicated optimal position. The bombs fell away from 94 aircraft, 1,200 pounds of high explosive per plane, 11,280 tons, total more destructive power than any single raid had ever delivered against a Japanese target. Then they watched, helpless, as the jet stream took their carefully aimed weapons and scattered them across Tokyo like leaves in a hurricane. Of the 6 others were unable to drop due to equipment malfunctions. The remaining 24 aircraft, roughly 25% of the force that reached Tokyo, managed to hit the target area. Japanese records later revealed that 48 bombs struck somewhere within the Musashino plant complex. Damage to the facilities was minor. Production continued at 96% of pre-raid capacity. Not a single critical manufacturing building was destroyed. But the true horror of high-altitude bombing from 30,000 feet was not the wasted effort or the bombs that missed their intended targets. It was what happened to those misplaced weapons. 9,000 pounds of high explosive, aimed at an aircraft factory in Tokyo's western suburbs, instead fell randomly across the world's most densely populated metropolitan area. Residential districts, schools, hospitals, and small workshops bore the impact of American ordnance scattered by atmospheric forces no bombardier could control. Japanese records documented approximately 150 civilian casualties from the November 24th raid, people who died not because American planners had targeted civilian areas, but because the jet stream had rendered precision bombing at 30,000 feet physically impossible. Hansel reviewed the strike photography and after-action reports with growing concern, but his faith in the doctrine remained unshaken. The problem, he concluded, was execution, not theory. Crews needed better training in high-altitude procedures. Bombardiers required more practice with the Norden site. Weather forecasts needed improvement. Intelligence about wind conditions must be gathered through reconnaissance flights. The solution to inaccurate high-altitude precision bombing was, Hansel determined, more high-altitude precision bombing conducted with greater skill and better information. Over the next 2 months, 21st Bomber Command launched raid after raid against Tokyo and other Japanese industrial centers. Each mission followed the same pattern. B-29 seconds would climb to 30,000 feet, approach targets in daylight formation, release bombs with meticulous Norden site procedures, and watch as the jet stream scattered their weapons miles from intended aim points. The Musashino plant became a symbol of this failure. American bombers attacked the facility 9 separate times between November and January, dropping thousands of tons of ordnance. The factory continued producing aircraft engines at near peacetime efficiency. The psychological impact on American crews was profound and demoralizing. They had been told they were flying the most advanced bomber in the world, equipped with technology that would enable surgical strikes against enemy industry. They had trained for months, mastering complex procedures for high-altitude formation flying and precision bombing. They risked their lives, crossing 3,000 miles of hostile ocean in aircraft that overheated, suffered pressurization failures, and caught fire, with disturbing regularity. And when they reached their targets and executed their bombing runs exactly as doctrine specified, their efforts accomplished almost nothing. The bombs fell, the jet stream took them, Japanese production continued. Japanese defenders, watching the American formations leave contrails at altitudes their interceptors could barely reach, began to understand that they faced an enemy who possessed technological superiority, but had somehow failed to recognize a fundamental flaw in their operational concept. Major Shoichi Sugita, commander of an interceptor unit equipped with the newest Ki-84 fighters, wrote in his diary after observing the December raids, "The Americans bomb from heights, we cannot effectively engage them, but they cannot hit what they aim at. If they reduce altitude to improve accuracy, we will destroy them. If they remain high to avoid our fighters, they waste their bombs. They have created a weapon their own atmosphere defeats." Sugita's analysis proved prescient. By early January 1945, General Arnold in Washington was receiving reports that made clear the B-29 campaign was failing. 4 months of operations had cost the Air Force's 15 B-29 seconds to combat an accident, hundreds of millions of dollars in ordnance, and 3,218 sorties flown by crews who returned exhausted, frostbitten, and increasingly demoralized. Japanese production of priority targets, aircraft engines, steel, machine tools, showed no statistically significant decline. The $3.7 billion investment in the Superfortress was producing results barely better than a propaganda exercise. Arnold, suffering from his 4th heart attack of the war in January 1945, understood that failure to achieve results with the B-29 would doom his vision of an independent air force. If the Navy's planned invasion of Japan succeeded where his bombers had failed, the post-war military establishment would remain Army-dominated, with air power relegated to tactical support roles. Everything Arnold had worked for depended on the B-29 proving that strategic bombing could force Japanese surrender. And Haywood Hansell, that true believer in daylight precision doctrine, could not deliver the results Arnold needed. The solution arrived at Guam on January 20, 1945, in the person of 38-year-old Major General Curtis E. LeMay. LeMay had commanded the 20th Bomber Command, operating B-29 seconds from China against Japanese-occupied targets, and was known as a pragmatist who cared nothing for doctrine when doctrine failed to produce results. His nickname among subordinates, Iron Ass, reflected both his demanding nature and his willingness to violate established procedures when operational realities demanded adaptation. LeMay had been briefed bluntly before leaving China: get results or face Hansell's fate. The B-29 would justify its cost, or heads would roll until someone found a way to make it work. What LeMay discovered when he reviewed Hansell's operations shocked him despite his experience with the difficulties of bombing from Chinese bases. The after-action reports documented systematic failure, bombs scattered miles from aim points, negligible damage to priority targets, and crew reports of wind conditions that made accurate bombing impossible. LeMay understood immediately that this was not a training problem or an execution problem. This was atmospheric physics defeating American doctrine. The solution would not come from flying the same missions with marginally better technique. The solution required abandoning 3 decades of Army Air Corps bombing theory and accepting that high-altitude precision strikes over Japan simply could not work as advertised. But LeMay also understood that he could not simply announce the abandonment of high-altitude operations. Arnold needed results fast, but those results had to come within a framework that preserved the B-29's reputation and the Air Force's post-war prospects. Any operational changes would have to be presented as tactical adaptations rather than admissions that the entire doctrinal foundation had been wrong. LeMay spent his first weeks on Guam flying the same missions Hansell had flown, achieving the same dismal results, while his staff analyzed every aspect of the B-29's capabilities and Japan's defenses, looking for an alternative approach. The solution, when it emerged, would shock American crews trained to believe that altitude meant safety and that daylight precision bombing represented the only moral and effective way to destroy enemy industrial capacity. LeMay would send his B-29 seconds not higher but lower, not in daylight but darkness, not carrying precision high-explosive bombs, but incendiaries, designed to set cities aflame. The transition from high-altitude precision strikes to low-level area attacks would happen in stages, each step carefully calculated to demonstrate improved effectiveness, while avoiding the admission that everything crews had been told about B-29 doctrine had been fundamentally wrong. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first hint that LeMay was preparing revolutionary changes came on February 4, 1945, when 21st Bomber Command launched its first major raid under his leadership, a daylight incendiary attack on Kobe, using 172 B-29 seconds. The aircraft still flew at high altitude, still approached in formation, but the ordnance bays carried not precision high-explosive bombs, but M69 incendiary clusters, weapons designed not to destroy specific buildings, but to start fires across wide areas. The raid destroyed approximately 1 square mile of Kobe's urban area. More significantly, it destroyed far more Japanese manufacturing capacity than months of precision attacks on specific factories had accomplished. The logic behind this shift was brutal but undeniable. Japanese war production in 1945 did not primarily occur in large, centralized factories that made ideal targets for precision bombing. It occurred in thousands of small workshops scattered throughout residential districts, tiny establishments employing 5 to 20 workers, producing components that fed into larger assembly operations. These workshops could not be targeted individually. They were too numerous, too small, and too dispersed for precision strikes to be effective. But they existed in wooden structures in densely packed neighborhoods that burned with terrifying efficiency when exposed to incendiary weapons. Destroying the workshops meant burning the districts that contained them. LeMay's staff had studied reports from the European theatre documenting the effectiveness of British area bombing against German cities. They had reviewed tests conducted at WWII proving grounds in Utah, where engineers had constructed mock Japanese residential districts using authentic materials and building techniques, then burned them with various incendiary weapons to determine optimal attack methods. The results were unambiguous. American M69 incendiary clusters, dropped in sufficient concentration, would create conflagrations that spread faster than Japanese firefighting services could control. Each M69 cluster contained 38 individual bomblets filled with napalm, a jellied gasoline mixture that stuck to surfaces and burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. When hundreds of these clusters ignited simultaneously across a neighborhood of wooden structures, the resulting fires merged into firestorms that consumed everything combustible within their reach. The ethical implications of this shift from precision to area bombing troubled some officers, including LeMay himself, who later acknowledged the moral questions inherent in attacks that would inevitably kill large numbers of civilians. But the operational realities, by February 1945, left few alternatives. High-altitude precision bombing had failed. Japanese production continued. American invasion plans were proceeding toward execution dates that would cost hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties. The B-29 had to prove it could force Japanese surrender, or the strategy Arnold had championed would fail completely. In that context, incendiary attacks against urban areas containing legitimate military-industrial targets became the only option that might produce decisive results. But area bombing with incendiaries from high altitude still faced the jet stream problem. Incendiary clusters, being lighter than high-explosive bombs, were even more vulnerable to wind displacement during their fall from 30,000 feet. The February 4th Kobe raid had achieved moderate success, but strike. Photography revealed that the fires had been scattered across a wider area than optimal concentration theory suggested would produce maximum destruction. LeMay understood that to make incendiary raids truly effective, his bombers would have to descend from the heights where they had operated with relative safety and attack from altitudes where accuracy improved dramatically. The decision to send B-29 seconds against Tokyo at low altitude on the night of March 9th to 10th represented the most dangerous calculated risk LeMay would take during his career. The plan violated every principle American bomber doctrine held sacred. Instead of high altitude, B-29 seconds would attack from between 5,000 and 7,000 feet altitudes, well within range of Japanese light anti-aircraft guns and searchlights. Instead of daylight, they would bomb at night, when visual references disappeared and crews could not maintain the mutually supporting formations that doctrine specified for defensive firepower. Instead of retaining the B-29's elaborate defensive armament, LeMay ordered all guns except tail turrets removed to reduce weight and allow maximum bomb loads. The rationale for these radical changes rested on careful analysis of Japanese air defense capabilities and limitations. Intelligence reports indicated Japan possessed very limited night fighter forces. Estimates placed the total number of aircraft capable of night interception at fewer than 50 for the entire home islands, and these lacked effective radar or ground control systems. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses, while numerous around major cities, suffered from primitive fire control systems that performed poorly against targets they could not see clearly. Searchlights could illuminate bombers at low altitude, but tracking and engaging fast-moving targets at night with manually aimed guns proved extremely difficult even when visibility was good. Most critically, the concentration of bombers over a relatively small area in a short time would overwhelm Japanese fire control systems that were designed to engage formations approaching at high altitude with time for tracking and firing solutions. LeMay's staff calculated that flying at night from low altitude against Japanese defenses optimized for daylight high-altitude attack would actually reduce losses compared to continued high-altitude daylight raids that achieved minimal results while exposing bombers to mechanical failures during extended flight at crushing altitudes. The key was concentration, getting hundreds of bombers over the target in the shortest possible time window, saturating defenses, starting fires that would illuminate the target area for following waves, and departing before Japanese defenders could coordinate effective responses. The mathematics suggested casualties might run as high as 70% in worst-case scenarios, but even 20% losses would be acceptable if the raid achieved decisive destruction of Japanese production capacity. The target for this first maximum-effort low-altitude incendiary raid was Tokyo's Shitamachi district, a densely populated area of eastern Tokyo containing an estimated 1 million people living in approximately 267,000 buildings constructed primarily of wood, bamboo, and paper. The district also contained what intelligence analysts conservatively estimated were 8,000 small and medium-sized war production facilities, manufacturing components for aircraft, munitions, and military equipment. The plan called for Pathfinder aircraft to mark the target area's boundaries with incendiary bombs creating a flaming X, followed by 325 B-29 seconds in stream formation individual aircraft following one after another rather than in defensive boxes, each carrying approximately 7 tons of incendiary clusters. The briefing for Operation Meeting House, as the mission was designated, shocked crews who had spent months training for high-altitude operations. Pilots who had internalized the doctrine that altitude meant survival now learned they would descend to heights where Japanese guns could hit them easily. Gunners, accustomed to manning turrets bristling with 50-caliber machine guns, discovered those turrets would be empty, their defensive armament removed and left on Guam. Navigators who had perfected formation flying techniques faced orders to proceed individually, without the mutual protection multiple aircraft provided. Some crews questioned whether LeMay had lost his mind. A few officers privately worried they were being ordered on a suicide mission to salvage a failed strategic concept. LeMay addressed these concerns in characteristically blunt terms. High-altitude daylight bombing was not working. Japanese defenses would remain until someone found a way to destroy them. The B-29 had cost too much and represented too great a commitment to fail. Night attack from low altitude, with incendiaries, was the only approach left untried that might produce decisive results. Crews would fly the mission as ordered, or he would find crews who would. The discussion was over. At sunset on March 9, 1945, the first Pathfinder B-29 seconds lifted off from Guam's North Field, followed by stream after stream of heavily loaded bombers. The aircraft climbed slowly, heavily laden with incendiaries, forming not into combat boxes, but into loose lines that stretched across miles of Pacific sky. As they approached Japan, pilots descended to assigned bombing altitudes 5,000 feet for the first wave, ramping up to 9,000 feet for later arrivals. The night was clear, with light winds at low altitude and visibility good enough for visual navigation once fires provided reference points. The Pathfinder aircraft reached Tokyo at midnight, identified the boundaries of the Shitamachi district using radar and visual landmarks, and dropped their incendiary loads in, the pattern that would create the guiding X. The M69 clusters ignited on impact, each cluster producing 38 individual fires that quickly merged into larger conflagrations. The main bombing force arrived over Tokyo beginning at 00:15, proceeding in stream through the target area at intervals calculated to maximize concentration while minimizing collision risk. Each B-29 released its 7-ton incendiary load, adding approximately 900 additional fires to those already burning below. What followed exceeded even LeMay's expectations for destructive effectiveness. The density of incendiary impacts overwhelmed Tokyo's firefighting capacity within minutes. Individual fires merged into block-sized conflagrations, which merged into district-sized firestorms. The physics of firestorms, self-sustaining thermal columns that draw in surrounding air at hurricane velocities and generate temperatures hot enough to melt glass, had been documented in European raids, but never deliberately created as a tactical objective. The Shitamachi district provided ideal conditions: wooden construction providing abundant fuel, narrow streets preventing effective fire breaks, and concentrated incendiary impacts, creating simultaneous ignitions faster than any firefighting response could control. Crews in later waves reported conditions over Tokyo that resembled descriptions of hell from classical literature. Fires burned so intensely that bombers at 5,000 feet felt turbulence from rising thermal columns. The smell of burning wood and materials penetrated aircraft, mixing with other odors crews tried not to identify. Some aircraft experienced severe updrafts from the firestorm below, gaining altitude despite pilots pushing control columns forward. Visibility paradoxically improved as fires spread. The entire target area glowed bright enough to read by, illuminating landmarks for navigation and bomb aiming. Japanese air defenses, optimized for high-altitude daylight attack, proved almost completely ineffective against the low-altitude night assault. Searchlights illuminated some B-29 seconds, but anti-aircraft gunners found that fast-moving targets at close range were nearly impossible to track and engage before they passed overhead. Night fighters launched from bases around Tokyo managed to engage a handful of American bombers, but achieved few kills. The concentration of aircraft over the target in a short time meant defenders had to select single targets from dozens of possibilities, and by the time they committed to an intercept, their prey was often already departing. The total American losses from the March 9th to 10th raid were 14 B-29 seconds, roughly 4% of the attacking force. This represented actually lower losses than many of the high-altitude daylight missions had suffered. The damage assessment revealed destruction that exceeded even worst-case projections. Approximately 16 square miles of Tokyo had burned completely, 267,000 buildings destroyed, 1 million people rendered homeless, and estimates of civilian fatalities ranging from 80,000 to over 100,000. The Shitamachi district and surrounding areas had ceased to exist as functional urban neighborhoods. More significantly, from the perspective of strategic bombing objectives, the 8,000 small war production facilities in the burned area had been eliminated. Components they would have produced: instrument parts, electrical connectors, hydraulic fittings, fabric panels, would never reach assembly plants. Japanese war production had suffered damage in one night that months of precision bombing had failed to inflict. LeMay reviewed strike photography and casualty reports with grim satisfaction. The mission had worked exactly as calculated. Japanese defenses had been overwhelmed. Incendiary concentration had created firestorms that consumed everything in their path. Most importantly, from the perspective of justifying the B-29 program, a single raid had destroyed more Japanese production capacity than the entire 4-month campaign of high-altitude precision strikes. The $3.7 billion investment in the Superfortress was finally producing returns that might force Japanese surrender without invasion. The ethical questions about Operation Meeting House would be debated for decades after the war ended. American planners argued that the target area contained legitimate military-industrial facilities essential to Japanese war production. The fact that these facilities existed within residential districts was a Japanese decision, placing war industry among civilians who worked in those factories and workshops. Destroying those facilities required accepting civilian casualties, but the alternative invasion of the home islands would produce far greater losses on both sides. The doctrine of total war that Japan had embraced when attacking Pearl Harbor and throughout its Pacific conquests created a context where distinguishing between civilian and military targets became increasingly meaningless. Japanese survivors described conditions during and after the raid in terms that documented the human cost of LeMay's tactical revolution. Firestorms generated winds strong enough to pick up adults and hurl them into flames. Temperatures in fire centers reached levels that caused spontaneous human combustion before flames arrived. Rivers filled with thousands seeking escape from heat and fire, many of whom drowned or died of burns. The scale of casualties overwhelmed medical services, morgues, and crematoriums. Bodies were buried in mass graves or simply stacked and burned in the ruins. The psychological impact on survivors who watched their neighborhoods, their homes, and their neighbors consumed by firestorms created trauma that persisted for lifetimes. But from the perspective of American strategic objectives in March 1945, Operation Meeting House achieved exactly what high-altitude precision bombing had failed to accomplish. Japanese production capacity had been devastated. The myth of homeland invulnerability had been shattered. And most critically for LeMay's immediate concerns, General Arnold now had results that justified the B-29 program and demonstrated that strategic bombing could force Japanese surrender. The campaign would continue raids on Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and other industrial cities followed within days, but the pattern was established. Low-altitude night incendiary attacks produced destruction that high-altitude daylight precision strikes could never match given the atmospheric realities over Japan. The transition from high-altitude precision doctrine to low-altitude area bombing represented more than just a tactical adjustment. It marked an acknowledgement that American bombing theory, developed in peacetime exercises and validated in European operations, had failed to account for conditions specific to Japan. The jet stream that atmospheric phenomenon meteorologists barely understood had made precision bombing from 30,000 feet physically impossible, regardless of equipment, sophistication, or crew skill. Japanese building construction and industrial organization had created a target set where area destruction proved more effective than precision attacks. The combination of these factors forced LeMay to abandon doctrine and embrace methods that achieved results, despite violating principles American airmen had considered fundamental. The irony was profound. B-29 crews had been told they would bomb from altitudes Japanese defenses could not reach, using technology that enabled surgical strikes against specific targets. The reality was that surgical strikes from unreachable altitudes accomplished nothing because the atmosphere scattered bombs miles from intended aim points. Effective bombing required descending to altitudes well within reach of Japanese defenses, and accepting that area destruction of districts containing targets was the only approach that worked given operational realities. The aircraft designed to be untouchable at 30,000 feet achieved its greatest effectiveness at 5,000 feet, where Japanese guns could hit it, but rarely did, because overwhelming numbers and concentration overwhelmed defenses, optimized for different tactics. Japanese military analysts, reviewing the shift in American tactics, recognized what had happened even if they could not prevent it. A captured intelligence document from May 1945 noted, "Enemy bombing tactics have evolved from high-altitude attacks that were ineffective due to atmospheric conditions to low-altitude incendiary raids that exploit vulnerabilities in our air defense systems and residential construction. Our anti-aircraft systems were optimized for high-altitude defense. Night fighter forces are inadequate. Capacity cannot cope with concentrated incendiary attacks. The enemy has learned our weaknesses and adapted their methods to exploit them. We have no effective countermeasures given current resources." The reference to current resources highlighted another critical factor in the B-29 campaign's success. By March 1945, Japanese industrial capacity, raw materials, and trained personnel had been depleted by 3.5 years of war. The Type 5 150mm anti-aircraft gun developed specifically to engage B-29 seconds at any altitude they could fly, represented exactly the weapon Japanese defenses needed. But only 2 Type 5 guns had been built by war's end. Raw materials and manufacturing capacity simply did not exist to produce effective weapons in quantities required. Similarly, radar-directed fire control systems that might have made night anti-aircraft operations effective remained prototypes because electronics production capacity had been devastated by earlier raids. Japan understood what it needed to counter low-altitude night bombing. It simply could not produce those countermeasures in time to matter. The B-29 campaign continued through August 1945, progressively destroying Japanese urban industrial areas and laying the foundation for what would become the most controversial use of the Superfortress delivery of atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic missions represented, in one sense, a return to precision bombing principles: single aircraft, high altitude, specific aim points, and weapons of unprecedented destructive power. But they also represented the logical endpoint of the journey that began when high-altitude precision doctrine failed over Tokyo in November 1944. When precision attacks could not achieve decisive results, doctrine had to adapt or fail completely. LeMay's willingness to abandon sacred principles and embrace methods that worked ensured the B-29 justified its enormous cost and achieved the strategic objectives Arnold had promised. The long-term implications extended far beyond the Pacific War. The recognition that high-altitude bombing faced serious limitations from atmospheric phenomena influenced post-war aircraft design and bombing doctrine. The jet stream, once documented and understood, became a factor in all flight planning at high altitudes. The development of jet-powered aircraft that could fly faster and higher than the B-29 reflected lessons about the need for speed to compensate for wind effects and altitude capability to remain above weather. The Cold War strategic bombing doctrine that emerged in the 1950s incorporated both high-altitude precision strikes using improved technology and low-altitude penetration tactics designed to defeat radar-directed defenses. The B-29's experience over Japan demonstrated that no single tactical approach would be universally effective. Flexibility and willingness to adapt proved more valuable than adherence to doctrine. Curtis LeMay continued in military service through the Cold War, eventually commanding Strategic Air Command and serving as Air Force Chief of Staff. He rarely discussed the specific decisions that led to Operation Meeting House and subsequent incendiary raids, deflecting questions to the operational necessity that required results regardless of personal feelings about methods employed. When pressed by historians decades later about the ethical dimensions of area bombing, LeMay's response was characteristically blunt. "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal. Every soldier thinks something of that at some point. But we had to end it. We had to bring the troops home." His refusal to apologize for tactics he had embraced reluctantly reflected the reality that wars are won by commanders willing to abandon failed approaches and implement methods that work, regardless of how those methods challenge pre-war assumptions. The crews who flew both the high-altitude missions and the subsequent low-altitude raids understood the transition in personal terms. Staff Sergeant Henry Hughey, a radar operator on a B-29 that participated in missions from November 1944 through August 1945, described the evolution in his post-war memoir. "We trained for months to bomb from altitudes the Japanese couldn't reach. We learned to trust our equipment and our training. Then we got to Saipan and learned that nothing worked the way they said it would. The winds up high were unbelievable. You couldn't hit what you aimed at even if you did everything perfectly. Going low was terrifying at first. We'd been told that low meant death, but low meant we could hit targets. We could see results. The moral questions about what we were hitting those came later. At the time, we just wanted to end the war and go home." The post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey documented what the high-altitude campaign had failed to achieve and what the shift to low-altitude attacks accomplished. The survey's findings made clear that Japanese war production showed no measurable decline from high-altitude precision raids conducted between November 1944 and February 1945. In contrast, Production declined sharply following the incendiary campaign that began in March. By July 1945, Japanese production of aircraft had fallen to 15% of peak capacity, machine tool production to 10%, and electronics production to virtually zero. The survey attributed this collapse primarily to low-altitude incendiary raids that destroyed dispersed manufacturing facilities and disrupted transportation networks connecting suppliers to assembly plants. The human cost of the transition from failed precision to effective area bombing remained a subject of historical debate and ethical scrutiny long after the war ended. American planners had expected civilian casualties would result from precision strikes on industrial targets located in urban areas. The shift to area bombing acknowledged that destroying dispersed targets required accepting civilian casualties on unprecedented scales. Whether this represented a justified military necessity or a war crime depended on philosophical positions about the ethics of total war, the legitimacy of attacking dual-use infrastructure, and the calculations of lives saved versus lives lost in different invasion scenarios. The debate continued precisely because the questions admitted no clear answers that satisfied both moral absolutes and operational realities of total war between industrial nations. What remained undebatable was that the B-29 campaign demonstrated both the limits of technology when atmospheric physics were not fully understood, and the critical importance of tactical flexibility when doctrine encountered reality. The high-altitude capability that made the SAV B-29 revolutionary also trapped American planners in a doctrine that could not account for the jet stream. Only by abandoning the altitude advantage the aircraft was designed to exploit could crews achieve the results the strategic situation demanded. This paradox that the B-29's greatest strength became a weakness until commanders abandoned, it offered lessons about warfare that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of bombing Japan. The story of why B-29 crews started bombing from 30,000 feet and Tokyo couldn't touch them is ultimately a story about how initial advantages can become liabilities when foundational assumptions prove wrong. American planners were correct that Japanese defenses could not effectively engage bombers at extreme altitude. They were wrong about whether effective bombing was possible from altitudes those defenses could not reach. The correction of that error required acknowledging that untouchable bombers accomplishing nothing were less valuable than vulnerable bombers that destroyed their targets. The willingness to make that acknowledgement, despite the professional and doctrinal costs, determined whether the $3.7 billion investment in the B-29 would justify its price or become history's most expensive failure. Curtis LeMay made that acknowledgement. High-altitude precision doctrine died over Tokyo in those first months of 1945, victim of atmospheric physics and Japanese industrial dispersion. Low-altitude area bombing emerged from that failure, controversial in method but undeniable in effectiveness. The B-29 crews who flew both missions understood the evolution in practical terms. What worked mattered more than what doctrine specified. They had been told they would bomb from heights the enemy could not reach. Reality taught them that reaching targets mattered more than being unreachable. That lesson, purchased at immense human cost on both sides, shaped strategic bombing doctrine for the remainder of the century. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.